did a podcast with Roy March about a year ago, and he
Yeah.
was just talking about the amount of capital being sucked into the data center industry and sort of coming out of core opportunities for office, retail, industrial, typical assets. And you hear these numbers, and it does feel astronomical relative to anything else going on in the real estate business.
It really is. I mean, and it's only inflating further as people now routinely throw around these gigawatt-sized data center campuses. And you have to remember, like a gigawatt of power is the equivalent of the entire city. Maybe it's a gigawatt and a half, but the entire city of San Francisco. And so these are just absolutely colossal, $10 billion plus investments in a single data center campus. So to your comment earlier, like the numbers really are, it's staggering how large these have become. But it's infrastructure. And that goes back to our comment of like infrastructure or real estate. These are really long-term assets where the intent is not in 15 years, the data center is obsolete and you're going to scrape it and rebuild it. It's really, if you're doing it right, they're intended to be infinitely upgradable. And like at Compass, that's how we build all of our gen sets, all of our power modules, all of our cooling units are all external. So in 15 years, if we've completely changed form factors and we're now using quantum computing and need like cryogenic cooling chambers, no problem. We'll just unplug our Vertiv units and plug in the new units right in the same spot. Maybe there's.
But don't you incur huge incremental costs for doing that? And so the economics, I mean, this obviously gets to the question of, the takeout. And that's the question on everybody's mind is, this is great. We understand why you'd want a long-term lease with these great credits. It makes lots of sense. But what happens at the end of 15 years or at the end of this takeout? What if the technology has changed so much that the capital cost to retrofit or to make this a current piece of technology just changes the economics substantially? How do you get comfortable with that decision today?
This is a great question, the residual value question, the obsolescence question. If you're designing your data centers correctly, it's infinitely upgradable because, again, it's space, power, and cooling. Maybe your cooling form factor changes. Again, if you're designing it correctly, you can upgrade it. Maybe your power density changes, which we've seen over the industry tremendously over the last number of years. You can upgrade it. If your data center is designed well to really be modular and to be future-proof, again, it's space, power, and cooling. So how you bring those to bear in the data center environment can really change, and it's okay. So if your data center is, and at Compass, like we really do, we pride ourselves on building 100-year assets that are infinitely upgradable, where in 15 years, the form factor is totally different, that's okay. Now, to your question of like, how do you underwrite that? Who pays for that? When we are leasing a data center to a customer, we are leasing them the shell, the pad, the shell, and all of the mechanical, electrical, and plumbing equipment. We then expect to make a return on that lease agreement, over the 10 to 15 year life of that lease. Thinking about year 16, if that lease is renewed, great. We may need to refresh or change some of that equipment. We may not need to. And then we want to sign another 15-year lease on that same unit. If in 15 years, the form factor has drastically changed, where power densities are now wildly different, cooling topologies are wildly different, we'll work out something with our tenant. They're not going to expect us to bear all of the capital for that because the data center that they leased from us, they're now asking for something drastically different. At the same time, with another 15-year lease agreement at a new negotiated renewal rate, you'd expect to receive the same or even higher return after you basically rebuild that. And let me say one other thing on this topic, because this is super interesting. People often really flag data centers as not creating a lot of jobs. And what I don't think people necessarily understand is, if I'm building a 10-building data center campus, let's say I'm building one building or even two buildings a year for the next 5 or 10 years. 10 years go by, building one is now 10 years old. it likely is going to be in need of a hardware refresh where they're going to, the tenant's going to take all the chips out, put all new chips in. And when they do that, they probably want different cooling. They probably want different power architecture. So now we are then retrofitting that building, working with the tenant to make it work for the next 10-year cycle. And all those construction workers then go from, the electricians, the plumbers, the pipe fitters, the concrete, the masonry workers, they all go from building 10 back to building 1. And then, and then the construction cycle just continues. So they're temporary jobs, but what people don't often realize is the level of permanence, because these buildings do require constant upgrade and retrofit. And that's one, baked into the economics, and two, based into the lease terms.